consequences, but one of them was democratization alongside with collapse of the Soviet system. So, if we have a look on Russia's post-communist experience, we will figure out that none of conditions of democratization, none of barriers toward maximization of power by politicians were built. All intra-elite conflicts were resolved as zero-sum games. There was zero-sum game in 1991, which contributed to destruction of the Soviet Union. There was a zero-sum conflict of 1993 between Yeltsin and the Russian parliament, and Yeltsin ultimately eliminated his rivals. And finally, the competition for Yeltsin's succession in 1999-2000 between two groups of elites around the Kremlin. Finally, Vladimir Putin and his team won in this struggle and co-opted their previous rivals. All instances of zero-sum games. Mass political participation. At least until the wave of protests of 2011-2012, it was a rather unimportant factor of politics. To put it very bluntly, masses served as instruments of elites. And still this tendency can be observed by now. International influence. Well, for good or for bad, Russia is very weakly linked with the outside world in terms of communication, migration, education, and information. No wonder that these linkages and leverages simply doesn't work. And finally, ideology not much matters after the Soviet collapse. It was some sort of Gorbachev's curse for post-Soviet politicians. The major lesson they learned that those who believed in whatever ideas in a very risk of becoming a loser. And ideas played a very much negligible role in post-Soviet politics, at least in Russia. So, if not democratization, then what? In the book I outline two major stages of regime's trajectory, and the third stage is just at the beginning, and it's too early to predict the future. So the period between 1991 and 2000 was early stage of authoritarian regime building, with weak state, with economic troubles, with elite conflicts and the like. While after 2000, because of impressive economic growth, strengthening the state, the political monopoly was established and developed in a full-fledged way. And in 2014, the regime launched some sort of asymmetric counter-attack because of well, perceptions of the major threat, and it sounds as a kind of very risky political game. So, what are political pillars of this regime? I refer here to a statement by Adam Przeworsky about political pillars of authoritarianism, such as lie, fear, and economic prosperity. And yet, economic prosperity was one of the major driving force of strengthening electoral authoritarian regime in Russia in the 2000s. And this economic growth allows authorities to buy loyalty, to co-opt their fellow travelers. Well, now it's probably no longer relevant given increasing problems of the Russian economy, decline of oil prices, foreign sanctions and counter-sanctions, and most experts agreed that there will be no way to repeat the success story of the 2000s. Lies, well, the increase of propaganda is visible, and probably some sort of compensation or substitution of economic prosperity, although lies at a certain point will meet its limits. Just referring here to famous statement attributed to Abraham Lincoln. And finally, the political sphere, which demonstrated some sort of tightening the screws since 2012, and particularly since 2014. Of course, besides political pillars, there are also institutional foundations of this regime. I outline here this super presidentialism, which is a major constitutive element of institutional design. Also, the hierarchical system of subordination on various layers of power, not only of the state power, but also in companies and other sectors of economy, and this is known in Russian political slang as the power vertical, and the use of party system as a third element of this political construction. So, what about possible further developments? Actually, I'm very bad at predicting the future, and overall political scientists are not so good in making good predictions. Or sometimes they do right predictions based upon wrong foundations. However, I outlined certain possibilities, such as the preservation of status quo regime and its further political decay over time, some sort of more systematic use of repressions by the ruling group, what is called as Iron First scenario. Yet it's still possible a sudden collapse of the regime in a popular manner, what tend to be called as black swan effect. And still, it's not excluded some sort of step-by-step creeping and quite probably inconsistent democratization, although I believe that the real practice of Russian politics could develop very much inconsistently as a combination of these trajectories, or turn from one trajectory to another. However, even though today we observe a rather gloomy picture, my guess that there should be no grounds for the deadly sin of sloth. And this book is entitled Authoritarian Russia, but it not mean that Russia is doomed to be an authoritarian country. Why is such a title? In fact, it's a replica of the title of book published in 1973 by Yale University Press. That book, called Authoritarian Brazil, it was an edited volume about Brazilian authoritarianism, which at that time was kind of success story of authoritarian regime. It was a military dictatorship which demonstrated high level of economic growth, strong domestic positions, and the like. And authors of various chapters discussed the future of Brazilian authoritarianism. One of these authors was future Brazilian President Fernando Henrique Cardoso. So they discussed the future of authoritarian Brazil. Next year, because of economic troubles, Brazilian regime launched very long process of political liberalization, contributed to numerous conflicts between government and opposition. It took 11 years before Brazil had new democratic elections. And in 1989, nearly the same group of authors who produced the book Authoritarian Brazil published a new edited volume called Democratizing Brazil. It's hard to make predictions in terms of time frame, but I do believe that at a certain point I will be able to write a new book called Democratizing Russia, and maybe we'll meet again in George Washington University and discuss this new book. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vladimir. So let's open it up. We have about 20 minutes for questions and discussion. So I'll just encourage people to participate. Yes, please, at the end. And just identify yourself, please.
Anthropology department, graduate student here from the Miles. I have a question about, you use the term anti-modernization. And what do you mean by that when you talk about anti-modernizing in Russia?
Yeah. Actually, Russian authorities posed economic development as their policy priority during the entire period of post-Soviet development. And if you have a look on Putin, he actually started his presidency from a very bold move that Russia should develop economically quite rapidly, and he invested a lot of efforts into promotion of growth and development policies. In 2014, these goals were sacrificed for the sake of geopolitics and countering efforts of the West to impose its will over Russia. This is what I mean anti-modernization term.
Great, yes.
A lot of scholars use the term cult of personality when describing these kinds of authoritarian regimes. How important do you think Putin's cult of personality is to maintain this authoritarian regime?
Well, it's a personalist authoritarian regime which is more or less about personality. And certainly, well, if imagine one day Putin will disappear, the regime will face with serious troubles. Yeah? But it's a hardly unique feature of Russia. You may find these features in many personalist regimes. And yes, it's a fundamental problem that these regimes are very vulnerable in terms of their institutionalization. For monarchies or for dominant party regimes, it's less a problem, and some of them are able to maintain mechanisms of power transfer more or less successfully. For personalist regimes, well, it's a fundamental problem, and I doubt that this regime will survive after Putin.
Okay, yes.
You mentioned that ideology didn't matter much after the Soviet collapse, and probably it seems that you based more on political and economical reasons and pillars. And I'm interested what place of Russian, so-called the Russian world, the idea of Russian world, in current ideology, because I think that our regime, our Putin regime, is very politically or biopolitically based in this.
Actually, when I talk about ideology, I refer to the system of values and attitudes which serve as a sort of guideline for political decision making. This is why we consider ideology as a sort of shared mental model, as Douglas North put it. Very often, the term ideology with regard to present-day Russia referred not to ideas and beliefs, but rather to some sort of political technologies. And the use of this Russian word is certainly political technology, but it's hardly an ideology. After all, people who promote the idea of Russian wolf cynical well enough and probably not much belief in what they promote.
But what's about 86%? Are they not shared this idea? Or because ideology is something that imposed from the top?
Yeah, but if tomorrow the television will say something completely different, they will say something else. So this is why I consider this as a political technology. It's not a belief. That's the fundamental problem.
Okay, yes.
Would you say that maybe the kind of going off the ideology, maybe more of a nationalistic idea that these 4 centuries, because you could argue that Russia's gone through about 4 or 5 centuries of authoritarianism, and so maybe even with this electoral authoritarianism right now and the whole corruption and kind of cooperation between elites and oligarchs, the people, the masses themselves don't really want to see a change. I mean, you see a very heavy increase in nationalism, maybe some xenophobia, especially with all these sanctions now. Could you argue that this gloomy picture is what we see from the outside, but inside Russia they don't see a gloomy picture?
Well, actually, there are 2 different dimensions. One, whether or not people would like to see change. And my understanding is that, it's a contradictory picture because many surveys, many observations demonstrated a strong dissatisfaction with everyday life, with corruption, with poor state of public services, education, public health, whatever. And from this perspective, of course, there is a demand for change. At the same time, people are really afraid changes, and that's one of the effects of trauma of the Soviet collapse, because, well, certainly major changes caused major troubles, and this motivation heavily exploited by authorities who said, if there will be major changes, then your life will become miserable. Let's have a look at what happens in Russia since the Soviet collapse in the 1990s, or let's have a look at what's going on in Ukraine and the like. And you know, it's a kind of trap. Yeah, you perceive possible changes as a greater risk vis-a-vis the status quo. To what extent this equilibrium may be maintained over time, it's a question. Yeah? At the moment, there is a kind of fear of major changes. But what we will observe in 5 to 10 years, whether people would like to preserve status quo at any cost, well, it's difficult to say. Let's see.
Did you? Yes, if yeah.
Sofyan Jamakov, Russian University. You said this is a personalistic regime, and that's very important. And I wanted to ask a question about another person than Putin, Medvedev. And was it possible at the Medvedev's time, as many hoped, that there would be some change of regime? Why did it fail in spite of big part of society and elite supported Medvedev? And is it just because of Medvedev's personality? Let's say if Sobchak hired you back then and fired that receptionist and you would be appointed as the receptionist, would it be different if you were that receptionist?
Well, you know, I choose a different path than those of Medvedev. He remained at the reception, I went out. But speaking more seriously, actually Medvedev was picked up exactly because he was still a receptionist. And my guess is that he was quite frank and open when he said that this decision about some sort of return substitution in 2011 was designed when he was promoted as a president So it was more or less like a scam from the very beginning. But I wouldn't say that, it was the only opportunity. In 2007, Putin faced with this two-term limit, and then he had to choose between various options. He could change the constitution, abolish term limit, similarly to what many post-Soviet leaders do, or he could propose a new constitution and adopt a new constitution, or whatever. For whatever reasons, he used this trick. He is certainly not alone in the global history. Again, numerous dictatorships used the same type of tricks like this in Mexico in 19th century. But Medvedev never was a kind of independent actor, and my guess that if I, quarter century ago, could choose this path, I would probably behave similarly. But I made another.
That's a good answer.
Yeah, I made another.
You would have no choice.
Yes, please.
Institute of International Studies. So your general argument was that politicians don't drop their power and authority without basically some kind of pressure. So my question is, actually, what is the nature of this pressure? And is actually the problem is with regime rather than with the nature of an alternative agenda? Because as I see, the issue is that the regime was developing a sophisticated discourse since the end of the 90s, and this discourse was changing and was adapted. On the other hand, opposition in all kinds was extremely static. And actually, one of the huge problems that we have now, that our opposition is still using basically the same rhetoric they used in the 90s, which is completely discredited because of the association with roaring 90s. And actually, yesterday, on Sunday, we had a major opposition event.
Excuse me, could you please pose your question?
Yeah, sure. I apologize. So my question is there a chance for actually opposition being developed, and could this be a way to form some kind of real democratic change rather than the regime issues you were talking about?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Actually, one might perceive the wave of protests of 2011-2012 as a sort of first step for re-emergence of political opposition of a new generation. Those people who run the Russian opposition now are not much related with the period of 1990s. They were basically too young for participation in these developments. However, you can't step into the same rivers twice. And what was possible in the 1990s is no longer possible in 2020s because of different political opportunity structure. And certainly political opportunity structure for the present-day Russian opposition is quite unfavorable. It's systematically harassed by authorities. It faced with very high entry barriers to political market, very limited pool of support among activists and the like. However, I wouldn't say that what we observe at the moment is a picture for a long decade. I believe that over time there will be a rising demand for changes. And the question whether the current, very loose and not well-organized opposition will capitalize this demand, or maybe this demand will be capitalized by somebody else, well, it's a matter of further developments. But my understanding that what we observe now is not what we will observe in next couple of decades or so.
Corey, thanks. Thanks for your great talk, Vladimir.
My question is about the receptionist again, and what has always puzzled me is what the significance of his presidency was. Why was he put there? Was it just to have somebody that wasn't Putin and it didn't matter who it was? Or was there something particularly about Medvedev's agenda and his rhetoric that was important to Putin at the time?
Yeah, thanks for the good question, on which it's really difficult to answer. Because in certain sense, Medvedev served as a receptionist with the boss in absentia, for these 4 years. At the same time, however, he attempted to pursue some sort of policy reforms, and it was not just a rhetoric. Of course, one might say that all this discourse about modernization were just empty words and the like. In fact, he attempted to do something, but if we have a look on output, the output was pretty much negligible. It was like the idea of large-scale police reform, which contributed to basically renaming of militia into police. Brian Taylor wrote about that in excellent paper. There was an attempt of high-tech developments which resulted in very, very partial, to put it very mildly, Skolkovo project, which is now nearly forgotten, and the like. And it clearly demonstrated that even some sort of intentions of policy reforms are not much possible in such a regime. But basically, I would say that it was more or less an interregnum of his presidency between two major periods of Putin's rule. So I still regard him as a sort of receptionist.
Yes, please. Nicholas Pope, Security Policy Studies Program. I was wondering, I scanned through the book quickly and I saw your last couple of sentences and where I believe you stated that you sort of see a free Russia sometime in the future. And I just was wondering, what does that look like to you? Does it mean democratic institutions? Does it mean economic prosperity?